The red recording light was on, but Whitney Houston had no idea she was about to create history. What happened in that studio booth on November 3rd, 1992, would shock everyone who witnessed it and leave one man in tears for the rest of his life. If you're a Whitney Houston fan, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear this incredible story. And don't forget to comment below with your favorite Whitney Houston memory. It was supposed to be just another recording session at Abbey Road Studios in London. Gary Morrison, Whitney's voice coach for over a decade, had heard her sing thousands of times. He thought he knew every note she could hit, every emotion she could convey. He was wrong. Whitney walked into Studio 2 that November morning wearing a simple white sweater and jeans, Gary recalls, his voice still trembling with emotion 30 years later. She had no makeup on, her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She looked like any regular person walking down the street. But when she stepped into that booth, something magical was about to happen. Gary had been working with Whitney since she was 19 years old, fresh from the gospel choir at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark. He'd guided her through her first album and helped her navigate the transition from church singer to global superstar. But nothing in their 10-year relationship had prepared him for what was about to happen. The backstory begins 8 months earlier when Kevin Costner first approached Whitney about starring opposite him in The Bodyguard. What most people don't know is that Whitney almost turned down the role 3 times. Kevin had been pursuing Whitney for this role for over a year, reveals Sarah Thompson, Whitney's personal assistant during that period. He would send flowers to her dressing room after concerts, leave voicemails with Clive Davis, even showed up at her mother Sissy's house in New Jersey to make his case. Whitney thought he was crazy. The role came with a soundtrack opportunity that would change everything. But first, they needed the perfect song. And that's where the real drama began. Kevin had this obsession with using Dolly Parton's "I Will Always Love You," explains David Foster, the film's music producer. But when we first presented it to Whitney, she wasn't just unconvinced. She was almost offended. She said, "That's a country song. My fans expect R&B. You're asking me to betray everything I stand for musically." The tension in that meeting was palpable. Whitney had built her career on powerful R&B ballads that showcased her gospel roots. Asking her to sing a country song felt like artistic betrayal. I remember Whitney standing up in the middle of that meeting and saying, "Find another song or find another actress," David Foster recalls. Kevin looked devastated. The entire project was hanging by a thread. What changed Whitney's mind was a phone call that came 3 weeks later, a conversation that would alter the course of music history. Dolly called Whitney directly on a Tuesday afternoon in April, Gary Morrison remembers. Whitney's face went from annoyed to shocked to deeply moved in the span of about 30 seconds. Dolly said, "Honey, I wrote that song in 1973 about leaving Porter Wagoner's show. It was my way of saying goodbye with love, but I believe you can take it to places I never could." Whitney hung up that phone and said, "Okay, let's try it. But we do it my way." But even with Whitney's agreement, the road to that November recording session was filled with obstacles that would have stopped most artists. 3 weeks before the scheduled recording, Whitney's voice began showing signs of serious strain. She'd been touring nonstop for 18 months, and her vocal cords were exhausted. Her doctor delivered news that terrified everyone on Whitney's team. Whitney had developed vocal nodules, Gary Morrison reveals for the first time. Small growths on her vocal cords that could permanently damage her range if she didn't stop singing immediately. The doctor recommended complete vocal rest. Whitney felt like she was letting everyone down. Gary implemented an intensive vocal rehabilitation program. For 3 weeks, Whitney could only speak in whispers for 2 hours a day. The rest of the time, she was on complete vocal rest. Whitney was panicked in a way I'd never seen before, Gary recalls. This was a woman who had never questioned her ability to sing. I remember her crying in my office, saying, "What if I can't hit those notes anymore? What if my voice is gone?" The day before they flew to London, Whitney was still battling nerves about whether she could deliver the performance the song deserved. Whitney asked me to meet her at her house at 6 a.m., Gary recalls. She wanted to try singing the song one more time before we left for London. When she opened her mouth, her voice was different. Not weaker, but more emotionally complex. The 3 weeks of rest had actually enhanced her instrument. When they arrived at Abbey Road Studios on November 2nd, the pressure was immense. The Beatles had recorded there. Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon was created within those walls. Now Whitney Houston was about to add her voice to that legendary legacy. What people don't realize is that this wasn't just about recording a song for a movie, reveals Tommy Williams, the sound engineer. Clive Davis had told Whitney that this recording would determine the direction of her entire career. If it failed, she'd be seen as someone who couldn't cross musical genres. If it succeeded, she'd become the biggest artist in the world. The original plan was to record the song as written, staying close to Dolly's country arrangement. David Foster had prepared a simple piano accompaniment, thinking they'd build the instrumentation around Whitney's voice later. But what happened next shocked everyone in that room. "I set up the piano at exactly 10:30 a.m., David Foster recalls. Whitney nodded, took one of those deep breaths that seemed to come from her soul, and started singing. But what came out of her mouth wasn't what any of us expected. Instead of following Dolly's melodic line, Whitney began improvising immediately. Her voice soared higher than the written melody, adding runs and embellishments that transformed the entire emotional landscape of the song. By the second verse, everyone in the control room had stopped what they were doing. Gary Morrison remembers. The engineers, the producers, even the security guard who happened to be walking by. Everyone was frozen, listening to what Whitney was creating. Tommy Williams, the veteran sound engineer, had worked with legends from Paul McCartney to Stevie Wonder, but he'd never experienced anything like what was happening. "I've been in this business for 25 years, Tommy says. I've heard perfect takes and terrible ones. But what Whitney was doing wasn't just singing, it was like watching someone paint with their voice." But the most shocking moment was yet to come. When Whitney reached the final chorus, something occurred that would become the stuff of recording studio legend. Her voice cracked slightly on the high note, and instead of stopping to do another take like any other professional singer would, she used that crack as an emotional pivot point. Whitney turned that tiny vocal imperfection into the most heart-wrenching moment of the entire song, David Foster explains. She made it sound like her heart was breaking right there in real time. It was the most authentic emotional expression I'd ever heard in a recording studio. Gary Morrison was standing in the booth next to Whitney when it happened. What he witnessed changed his understanding of what a human voice could accomplish. Whitney closed her eyes during that final chorus, Gary recalls, tears forming as he remembers the moment. Her hands were clenched into fists. "I could see every emotion she'd ever felt about love, loss, and saying goodbye pouring out through her voice. It wasn't just singing anymore. It was like watching someone's soul leave their body and return." What made the moment even more powerful was what Whitney was thinking about while she sang, something she revealed to Gary immediately after the session. When Whitney opened her eyes after finishing the song, she was crying, Gary remembers. She told me later that during that final chorus, she was thinking about her father John, who had died 3 years earlier. She was singing to him, telling him that even though he was gone, she would always love him. When Whitney finished the song, there was complete silence in the studio for nearly 30 seconds. Nobody moved, David Foster remembers. Nobody spoke. We all knew we just witnessed something that would never be repeated. Whitney opened her eyes and asked, "Should I do another take?" I couldn't even speak. I just shook my head. Gary Morrison was the first person to react, and his response shocked everyone, including Whitney. "I started crying," Gary admits. "Not just a few tears. I was sobbing. 30 years of working with singers, and I'd never heard anything like what Whitney had just done. She looked at me through the glass and mouthed, 'Are you okay?' I couldn't answer her because I was crying too hard. But Gary wasn't the only one having an emotional reaction. Tommy Williams found himself equally overwhelmed. "I realized I'd forgotten to check the technical levels during the last half of the song," Tommy admits. "I was so mesmerized by what Whitney was doing that I forgot to do my job. I was listening as a human being, not as a technician." Unknown to everyone in the room, Kevin Costner had arrived at the studio during Whitney's performance. He was standing in the hallway outside Studio 2 when he heard her voice through the soundproof door. Kevin told me later that he could hear Whitney singing through the walls, David Foster reveals. The emotional power of her voice was so intense that it penetrated the studio's sound isolation. He knew the movie would be successful the moment he heard her sing that song. When Whitney emerged from the vocal booth, She had no idea that she just recorded what would become one of the best-selling singles of all time. Whitney was actually disappointed with the take, Gary Morrison recalls. She said, "My voice cracked on the high note. We should do it again. I told her, Whitney, that crack just made you millions of dollars. That's the take that's going on the album." But Kevin Costner's reaction was immediate and decisive. He pulled David Foster aside and made a statement that would prove prophetic. Kevin said, "That's not just a song. That's a cultural moment," David Foster remembers. "When people hear Whitney sing that, they're not going to be listening to music. They're going to be feeling something they've never felt before." The technical aspects of what Whitney accomplished that day are staggering. The song spans more than 3 octaves, requires incredible breath control, and demands both power and vulnerability in the same performance. Whitney hit notes that day that weren't even written in the song, explains Dr. Sarah Chen, a vocal coach at Berklee College of Music. She expanded the melody in real time, creating new harmonic possibilities that enhanced the emotional impact. But she never let technique overshadow emotion. But for Gary Morrison, the technical brilliance wasn't what made that day special. What Whitney did that day wasn't about showing off her range or proving how many notes she could hit, Gary reflects. She found the soul of that song and gave it a voice. Dolly wrote it about letting someone go with love. Whitney sang it like someone who understood that pain personally. The immediate aftermath of that recording session revealed just how special the moment had been. David Foster played the recording for Clive Davis, Whitney's mentor and the head of Arista Records, that same evening. Clive's reaction was immediate and definitive. Clive listened to the entire song without saying a word, David remembers. When it finished, he opened his eyes and there were tears. He said, "This is the biggest hit Whitney will ever have. This is the song that will define her career." He was right. When Dolly Parton heard Whitney's version, her response brought everyone to tears. Dolly called Whitney personally after hearing the recording, Gary Morrison recalls. She said, "Honey, that's not my song anymore. You've made it yours, and it's better than I ever dreamed it could be." Whitney cried when she hung up that phone. The song's journey to becoming a cultural phenomenon began immediately, but not without challenges. Radio programmers initially resisted the song because it didn't fit neatly into any category. It was too pop for R&B stations, too R&B for pop stations, and too powerful for easy listening formats. The first radio programmer we played it for said it was too emotional for daytime radio, reveals Mark Stevens, who handled promotion for Arista Records. He said people would have to pull over if they heard Whitney sing that song while driving. The breakthrough came when a DJ in Atlanta played the song during morning drive time and received the largest response in the station's history. "The phone lines lit up like Christmas," Mark Stevens remembers. People were calling to share their own stories about love and loss. Whitney's performance wasn't just entertaining people, it was healing them. Within 2 weeks, the song was being played on every format across the country. The real impact was measured not in airplay, but in the emotional responses it generated. We started receiving letters from people whose lives had been changed by hearing Whitney sing that song, Gary Morrison reveals. A woman wrote that she listened to it every day while caring for her dying mother. A man said it helped him process his divorce. Whitney read every letter. The song went on to spend 14 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, becoming the longest-running #1 single by a female artist in chart history. It sold over 12 million copies worldwide and earned Whitney a Grammy Award for Record of the Year. But the commercial success wasn't what mattered most to the people who created it. The sales numbers and chart positions weren't what we celebrated, David Foster reflects. We celebrated the fact that Whitney had found a way to use her gift to touch something universal in human experience. The impact on Gary Morrison was profound, changing not just his career but his understanding of what music could accomplish. That recording session changed how I thought about music and what the human voice could accomplish, Gary admits. "I've worked with hundreds of singers since then, but I've never experienced anything close to what Whitney did that day. She channeled something universal about love and loss." The recording also revealed something about Whitney's character that few people knew. "After we finished recording, Whitney asked me to play the song back one more time," Gary remembers. "She listened with her eyes closed. When it ended, she said, 'I hope this helps people feel less alone when they're going through heartbreak.' That's who Whitney really was. someone who used her gift to help others heal. Years later, Gary Morrison still gets emotional when he hears "I Will Always Love You" on the radio. "Every time I hear it, I'm transported back to that studio booth," he says. "I see Whitney with her eyes closed, pouring her heart out. I remember thinking that I was witnessing something that would outlive all of us. I was right. The song became the best-selling single by a female artist in music history. But for those who were in Studio 2 that November day, the sales numbers weren't what mattered. We knew we'd witnessed greatness," David Foster reflects. "Not because of what the song would become commercially, but because of what Whitney revealed about the power of human emotions expressed through music. She showed us what it means to be completely vulnerable and authentic in your art." Today, music students around the world study Whitney's recording of "I Will Always Love You" to understand vocal technique and emotional expression. But for Gary Morrison, the lesson is simpler. "Whitney taught me that the greatest performances happen when you stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be real," he says. That day in the studio, she wasn't thinking about hitting the right notes or impressing anyone. She was just telling the truth about what it feels like to love someone so much that you're willing to let them go. The recording session lasted only 45 minutes, but its impact has lasted for over 30 years and continues to grow with each new generation that discovers Whitney's voice. The song has been covered by countless artists, but no one has ever come close to capturing what Whitney achieved that November day. The reason isn't technical, it's emotional. Whitney didn't just sing the notes, she lived them. "I've heard hundreds of covers of that song," Gary Morrison notes. "Some are technically excellent, some are beautifully arranged, but none of them have that moment where you feel like the singer is sharing their actual soul with you." That's what made Whitney's version irreplaceable. The recording also changed how the music industry approached crossover songs. Record labels began looking for artists who could transcend genres not through calculation, but through authentic emotional expression. After Whitney's success with "I Will Always Love You," every label wanted their own version, David Foster explains. But they missed the point. It wasn't about taking a country song and making it R&B. It was about finding an artist who could make any song their own through the power of genuine emotion. For Whitney herself, the recording became both a blessing and a burden. Every performance for the rest of her career would be measured against that perfect moment in Studio 2. Whitney told me years later that she felt pressure to recreate that magic every time she performed, Gary Morrison reveals. "I had to remind her that magic can't be manufactured. It happens when it happens." Her job was to stay open to those moments, not to force them. The song's influence extends beyond music into popular culture. It's been featured in countless movies, covered emotional moments in television shows, and become the go-to song for expressing deep love and painful goodbyes. "I Will Always Love You" became the soundtrack to people's most important moments, Gary reflects. Weddings, funerals, breakups, reunions. Whitney's voice has been there for millions of people during their most vulnerable times. Whitney gave that song a piece of her soul, Gary Morrison concludes, and everyone who hears it gets to carry that piece with them forever. That's the real magic of what happened that day, not the technical brilliance or the commercial success, but the human connection she created through her voice. The red recording light went off at 11:47 a.m. on November 3, 1992. Whitney Houston walked out of that vocal booth having created a masterpiece that would define her legacy and touch millions of hearts around the world. And Gary Morrison, her voice coach and witness to greatness, is still crying tears of joy every time he remembers what he saw that day. "People ask me what it was like to work with Whitney Houston," Gary says. "I tell them it was like being present at the creation of something eternal." That recording session didn't just capture a song, it captured the essence of what makes music healing and transformative. 30 years later, "I Will Always Love You" continues to help people through heartbreak, just as Whitney hoped it would. And for Gary Morrison, that's the greatest testament to what happened in that London studio on a November morning when Whitney Houston stopped trying to sing a song and started trying to heal the world. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories about music's greatest legends. What's your favorite Whitney Houston memory? Share it in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell for more incredible behind-the-scenes stories from music history.